several meetings, we're studying about feasts for God's nation and how it is related to mentality, culture, prophecies, like many things. We actually finished reviewing what God names Lord's feasts, so feasts of Lord. Leviticus chapter 23 had the best probably list of them with all explanations, with other places in Torah giving more information. And it ends with Leviticus 23:44. And Moses declared unto the children of Israel the feasts of the Lord. So that's how they're named. And here is pointing also as a source of information, source of the commandments. It's from the Lord. Now, see that the feasts of the Lord are related to history, but they're also related to future, right? Even when God was telling it to Moses, we can tell that when God was telling it to Moses, the three of the feasts were already history. It was like Passover, it was leaving Egypt, it already happened, or Shavuot, when God gives his Torah, his law to Israel. It already happened. But some feasts were in the future. And we understand that, like for Yom Kippur, for example, it points to the eschatological judgment. It's in the future. So it didn't happen yet. But even those feasts which are historical, like Passover, they also had future future fulfillment. The Passover is not only living Egypt, but it's also crucifixion of Christ. So for Moses, it was in the future. So future and past in those feasts are entangled. And that's how it is seen in general, the concept of time in Jewish or in biblical mentality. It is not just linear. It's not like our Western concept of time. It is future is in the past and past is in the future. It's all connected to each other. And by celebrating those feasts, we're actually joining the history of God's nation and we're joining the future of God's nation. We accept the future, the prophecy to ourselves if we celebrate the feasts or if we participate, if these feasts are ours. And the opposite is true also. If we're celebrating feasts of Gentiles, we're actually joining their history. We accept on ourselves the history of Gentiles. We become one of Gentiles. And we accept the future of Gentiles also to ourselves, which is, we know what is future of Gentiles, right? It is eternal perdition. So do we need to do it? Probably not. We should not take history, nor the future of Gentiles. Now, after we review the feasts of the Lord, there are two other feasts which are Israel's feasts, but they are not feasts of the Lord. But being feasts of Israel, they are also mentioned in the Bible. Both of them are after Sukkot. Do you remember when we studied Sukkot, the very last day, the 8th day after Sukkot, the Shemini Atzeret? We told that the calendar ends because it is symbolic of the eternal kingdom. So nothing after else, right? But two feasts of Israel happen after it. And those feasts are Purim and Hanukkah. And let us see what is that and why they even exist in Bible, though they're not Lord's feast, and why they are after Sukkot. There is a meaning to it. Regarding Purim, it is very well known, right? It's probably the most loud of all feasts celebrated by Jews nowadays. They drink and they get drunk on that day. And they get very, very happy. Why? Because the whole nation was saved. They could be completely exterminated. Almost 2,500 years ago, 2,400 years ago. They could be completely exterminated, but God saved them in a very miraculous way. It is described in the book of Esther, where during Persian Empire's time, and Persian Empire being actually the first empire which accepted human rights, freedom of religion, freedom of culture. It was kind of cool for Jews to be inside Persian Empire, but unfortunately for them, one of viziers of Shah of Persian Empire, vizier being like prime minister or chief counselor of the king of Shah, he was Haman, he was Amalekite, he was enemy of Hebrews from ancient animosity from the time of Exodus. You remember when Hebrews just left Egypt in book of Exodus, Amalekites traveled a long way to have a battle to fight with Israelites. That was ancient animosity. Now I don't know how much of history Haman knew about his ancestors, Amalekites, when God of Israel told to finish, to exterminate Amalekites completely. But Saul, the first king of Israel, disobeyed God and left some of them alive, including the king. And as consequences, Haman is in the palace of Persian Shahanshah, of Persian king of kings, 600 years later. And 600 years later, now, he is a danger. He is a source of danger of complete extermination of the Israelites. And God saves him through, interestingly, through Mordecai and Esther, who are descendants of family of Saul. It is a completely different topic. You can read about it in Esther, book of Esther, and in the very first chapter of Esther, it is mentioned that Mordecai was of the house of Kish, who was father of Saul. So when they were saved by God in a miraculous way, they celebrated that day, Purim, the day when Haman was planning to exterminate them. And they were celebrating it, and they were sending gifts to each other. And it is described in Book of Esther, chapter 9. We can read verses 17, 18, for example. On the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day of the same rested day, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews that were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on 14th thereof, and on 15th day of same they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Okay, so month Adar is the very last month of biblical calendar, 12 months. So Purim is somewhere in the middle of February. It is mentioned in the Bible, of course, it's well described, but I saw an interesting parallel to this verse in Esther 9:22. It is written in Esther 9:22 about Purim, when they were saved from destruction. Jews were very glad, and it is written, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the months which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning unto good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. So they were sending food and gifts to each other. And that was a result of that joy of salvation. And that is the signature, that is the symbol of Purim, when they send gifts to one another. Interestingly, in book of Revelation, we see something similar done by infidels. In Revelation 11:10, we see, and they that dwell upon the earth shall rejoice over them, and make merry, and shall send gifts one to another, because these two prophets tormented them that dwelt on the earth. Well, this is about beasts, the beasts coming out of abyss, destroying two prophets of God. And because the two prophets of God, how it is seen by Gentiles or by infidels, they tormented those infidels. And now infidels, they feel like they're saved and they're very glad, and they send gifts to each other. So what is described in Revelation 11:10 is literally a language of Purim. And if we understand Well, we know that partially that prophecy about the two witnesses, the two prophets, and the beast which destroys them, partially it was fulfilled during a race of atheistic movement and movement of humanism in Western Europe in end of 18th, beginning of 19th century. We know that, but that fulfillment is not full fulfillment. That's not complete. There will be eventually a full fulfillment, and probably in the nearest future. And we know that the controversy is very thin, very religious. By those who worship the beast, it is also seen as religious controversy. So what they do it consciously. They see the two prophets of God here in Revelation 11:10, they see that they tormented and they are now freed. So they see it with different vision from different side, and they see like they are people of God, and they had those enemies, and now they are freed from those enemies. The enemies who tormented them. Well, God tells that actually they're infidels, and their enemies were God's prophets. But those people, the infidels, they have corrupted vision. So they see themselves as Israel or as God's people. And now, when they are freed from the danger or freed from those who were God's prophets tormenting them, they are glad and they send gifts to each other, which is, again, it's language of Purim. So they kind of celebrate their salvation. That's how it is seen here in Revelation chapter 11. So it is Purim upside down. The infidels are glad, and the infidels celebrate what they think is Purim, their salvation from enemies. But in reality, it's the other way. Interesting. Well, uh, another feast of Israel is Hanukkah. And we all know Hanukkah is celebrated somewhere in December, right? That's how we know. It is somewhere in winter. And what is that? Besides those strange menorahs in Jewish homes of 9 candles instead of 7, how the real menorah should be. And what is it about? Well, interestingly, Hanukkah is also a feast mentioned in the Bible. Even more interesting, it's never mentioned in the Old Testament. It's mentioned in New Testament, specifically in Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 22. We can read John 22, 10:22. And it was at Jerusalem the feast of dedication, and it was winter. And Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. So Jesus comes to the temple at the feast of dedication of the temple. That's dedication of the temple. And the dedication is Hanukkah. That's exactly the feast of dedication. And yet it is in winter. It is in December, roughly. And Jesus looks like he celebrated or he did something. He was at least he was coming to the temple. And that's the only place in the Bible where this feast is. The reason why it is not mentioned in Old Testament, because Hanukkah is commemoration of the event which happened after the canon of Old Testament was closed. Canon of Old Testament was closed by Ezra. We remember, right? It was during Persian government, while Hanukkah, dedication of the temple was dedication from destruction by Greeks. Well, Persians never destroyed Jewish temple. Persians actually were very friendly towards Israel, Jews. By Greeks, after Alexander the Great, they were not at all. And Antiochus Epiphanes was a great enemy of Israel. Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated Jerusalem, desecrated the temple, prohibited celebration of Jewish feasts, interestingly, and all the pressure, religious oppression, which that Greek king was applying, led to massive revolt of Jews. The revolt was led by priests. the family of Maccabees. And the family of Maccabees actually won several battles against Greeks. And they were able, for some short period of time, to re-establish independent Israeli government in Jerusalem and suburbs. A small territory, but they were able to keep it independent for some period of time, and they were able to clean the temple, and after cleansing the temple, to restore, rededicate the temple and to restore the service. Now, the happened that when they were about to restore the service in the temple, what is the first thing what the priest should do every morning in the temple? Cleanse and rekindle the menorah. Menorah, the lampstand with 7 lamps, should be continually burning and giving light in the presence of God in the temple. And it requires clean, specially prepared olive oil. And they wanted to restore the service. And for restoring the service, the very thing which you do is burning the menorah, kindling the menorah again. But they had an amount of oil for 1 day only. But the process of preparation of oil, so that the oil should continuously come, yes, because it's consumed by fire. So it will take 8 days. So they knew that they have enough oil for 1 day, and the next portion of oil, which they will receive from those who prepare it, will come 8 days later. And there was a dilemma. Should we start burning now? Like it will burn for 1 day, and then we wait 8 days for next portion to continue it. And they decided that yeah, let us do it. And even if it lasts 1 day, let us do it. And yeah, then 8 days later we'll restore it again. And here the miracle from God happened. The amount of oil which will have to be enough for 1 day only, by all laws of physics and chemistry, actually it's burning, so it's chemistry, but that amount of oil lasted for 8 days. So they kind of fill the lamp. They know that this lamp, this amount of oil should burn completely in 1 day, but it lasted 8 days instead, just until the moment came when they already replenished the amount of oil which is needed to continue it. So there is no interruption. God made miracles. That's why for 8 days and one candle for starting and 8 others symbolizing those 8 days. That's why those menorahs of 9 branches in Jewish homes. But that is a symbolics which is probably even later. But the celebration of dedication of the temple was a great celebration of that God made a miracle for his people, even though there was no Ark of Covenant anymore in the temple. Even though they sinned, it was after Babylonian captivity, they were not free, they're not independent anymore, but God made a miracle for them. God helped them against the pagan enemies. So that was celebrated in the month Kislev, and it was celebrated during 8 days. Now, interestingly, there are parallels between Hanukkah and Sukkot. The very first parallel probably is that Greek government during that oppression period, it prohibited celebrating Sukkot completely. So that was the biggest feast for Israeli nation. And Greeks just prohibited, and you cannot celebrate Sukkot in concealed way, because you need to build those sukkahs outdoors. You cannot hide it inside home. You probably can celebrate Passover somehow in concealed way, but you cannot celebrate Sukkot in concealed way because you should do it outdoors. So Greeks were prohibiting it. And now, instead of those 8 days, do you remember we were telling that Sukkot is 7 days, and then day number 8 is Shemini Atzeret. So instead of those 8 days of celebration, they receive those 8 days of celebration of Hanukkah. Another interesting parallel is that Hanukkah starts exactly 70 days after the Sukkot starts. Yeah, if you count from beginning of Sukkot, when it is in 7th month on day 15, to that 25th of Kislev, which is 9 months, it is 70 days. Just count inclusive counting, how Jews count. And it ends also the 8th day, the last day of Hanukkah, is exactly 70 days after Shemini Atzeret, that 8th day of Sukkot. So it is some parallel. Another parallel, which it's not with Sukkot directly, but I just wanted to attract your attention to something which I don't understand quite well yet. But after Yom Kippur is on 7th month, day 10. Until Hanukkah passes 75 days. That number of 75 additional days or years we see in prophecy of Daniel. If we see prophecy, one of the least understood prophecies of Daniel, right? It's Daniel 12:12. When it is told about that additional period of time, we know that period of 2260, yes, in Daniel. But in Daniel 12:12, there is another period. Let me read. Blessed is he that waiteth and comes to the 1330 days. Now, 1335, it is 1260 plus 75. So this is a gap of 75 days in addition. And if we understand that 1260, it points somehow to Yom Kippur. The 75 days after Yom Kippur, it is Hanukkah. After 10th day of 7th month, at 75 days, you come to Kislev 25. That's the beginning of Hanukkah. So if Yom Kippur is prophetic Yom Kippur in Daniel, then can it be something which is related to prophetic Hanukkah? Even though Hanukkah didn't exist yet in times of Daniel. Something not very clear to me yet, but something to think about. Those numbers work here. Well, while those two feasts, Israel's feasts, are happening after Shemini Atzeret, we know that the Lord's feast had to describe all prophetic journey of God's nation to eternal kingdom. So then Sukkot, Shemini Atzeret, eternal kingdom. But God's people disobeyed. God's people disobeyed, and that's why in old times these two feasts happened. Let us think, what is Purim and what is Hanukkah? Both Purim and Hanukkah are results of God's nation, Israelites or Jews, disobeyed God. Because of that, the Gentiles prevailed over them. God's people lost their independence. God's people were endangered. God's people were oppressed. And then God makes some miracle and saves them. That is Purim and that is Hanukkah. Purim is oppression from Haman in Persian Empire. Hanukkah, oppression of Antiochus Epiphanes in Greek kingdom. Both things, Gentiles are prevailing, but then God does something, makes some miracle, and saves his people. So these both feasts were not God's original plan, because God's original plan for Israeli nation was not to be subdued by Gentiles. God's original plan to Israelite nations were to become a kingdom of priests and kings. So it was for Israelite nation to grow and to influence all earth around and to reach and to help to turn all population of all nations of earth to turn to living God. But they did not work well. They did not work well. They lost their independence. They lost a lot. And Gentiles also, because of that, lost a lot. But what happened, those two feasts, that is the result of disobedience of God's people, and that God had to step in to save them. Now, Does that something similar happen on global scale with not with Israel nation, but with God's church, with God's nation in grand globally, and also God has a plan for us, but disobedience leads to God's plan to work not exactly how God wants it to work, but somehow different. And as a result, again, infidels will prevail for some period of time. Infidels will endanger God's people, but at the very end, the very last moment, God will step in and save. So Purim and Hanukkah, even not being Lord's feast, because it's not God's original plan, but it is still uh, some part of history which God shows as prophecy. And that's why actually they're happening after all Lord's feast, yes, and they happen in winter. Now, uh, after Lord's feast and after feast of Israel, we should step in to study false feast. And it started in old times. We know that Satan, through Gentile nations, through other teachings, through other religions, always was trying to influence God's people and to distort something in the culture of God's people and in the religion which God gives to his people. And we see it, for example, in Daniel 7:25, we read, and Daniel tells it as a prophecy that and Daniel 7:25, and he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given unto his hand until time and times and the dividing of time. Well, the changing of times, that in Aramaic the word zaman, and that is not a prolongation of time, but that is some appointed time. That means it's some specific season or some appointed time, which is a very usual word to some festivities also. So over here, the changing of laws and changing of the feasts are given in this verse very side by side with each other. And that thing is prophesying by Daniel as something in the future. And we will see, yes, it definitely happens in the future from Daniel and in our times, but it was starting even before Daniel. And we can read it in many places, in Old Testament also, how they started to celebrate something else. For example, uh, we'll see it now, but one of most probably the most popular feasts, which you know, I know, like everybody knows, but they're not in the Bible, are Rosh Hashanah. Yeah, don't be surprised. Rosh Hashanah is not biblical. It is distortion of biblical Feast of Trumpet. And it is Babylonian New Year brought to Israelites as a result of Babylonian captivity. So Rosh Hashanah, yes, it is Jewish holiday, but it's not Israelite holiday, and it's not God's holiday. Sunday, yeah, it's replaced Shabbat. Easter, yeah, in English language, they often tell Easter instead of Passover, but Easter is completely different feast. It just replaced the Passover. Passover is Pesach, yes, biblical holiday. Easter is instead of Passover, just like Rosh Hashanah is instead of Yom Teruah, Feast of Trumpet, and Christmas, which doesn't have even anything in Bible to replace. It's just completely alien. Well, let us see. Shabbat probably is the thing which is best known to most of us because we all recognize that, yeah, Shabbat was changed. It was modified somehow. Sunday people started in Western world and then in Eastern Christianity also to celebrate Sunday instead of Shabbat. And why did it happen? How? We all know, so things we will revise them now, but what I wanted to now to emphasize, it is now a very popular idea among many Adventists and some other Christians that the Shabbat, which is like every seventh day, which corresponds to a common Saturday, though I don't like this word, Saturday. So this Shabbat is not real biblical one, but the real biblical Shabbat should be some other day, and it should alternate, and it's not the same day of the week every time. I saw so many times of publications trying to bend the facts somehow to bring this idea. This idea is completely not biblical and not logical. It ignores so many facts from Bible and history. First of all, it always rests on somehow on idea that there should be even number of weeks in a month, which never works. Month is 30 days, 29 or 30. Hebrews were counting months as lunar months, and 7 multiplied by 4 is 28, so it doesn't match. Definitely, it cannot be the same day of months always, and it cannot be the same phase of moon. So Shabbat does not correspond to phase of moon, because phase of moon doesn't change according to, it is 29 days, so it doesn't divide by 7. Another thing which usually people tell, and I'm telling it now because this thing is, as gossips, passed from one person to another, and it's becoming so popular now. We should know these things, right? To distinguish where is gossip and where are facts. So when it is often told that when Catholic Church changed the calendar in the Middle Ages, that Julian calendar to Gregorian calendar, Shabbat also changed because of that. And we cannot rely on Catholic calendar to celebrate Shabbat. Well, we actually do not, because the change of Julian calendar in the beginning in the Roman Empire did not affect days of a week. Change of Julian calendar to Gregorian calendar in Middle Ages did not affect days of week also. They were affecting days of months, but the week, it was never interrupted. It is very easy to check by document, and it becomes very obvious also by the very fact that Gregorian calendar was not introduced in all countries at the same time. In some countries, it's not introduced even today. One of the first, probably, it was introduced in Spain. It was introduced in Spain in 1582. Spain was good Catholic country. 1582, how the Pope told, that's what they received. Yes. Prussia, which was a kingdom or country of North Germany, Prussia accepted it much later in 1610. Protestant Germany did not want to accept it for a very long time until it became just really inconvenient, that desynchronization. Only in the year 1700 they accepted. UK was holding much longer. In Englishmen, they accepted it only in 1752. Russia was far from Catholic world. They were Greek Orthodox, or rather Russian Orthodox Church, a different church. So they definitely didn't obey the decree of Roman Pope, and they accepted and they accepted it only in 1918, where the communist secular government came to power. 1918. What is interesting, there were already by that time there was a difference of 13 days between Western European countries and Russia. So there were places where you were literally traveling in Poland from Russian side to Polish Catholic side or beyond to West. And it was like in one city, it was one day, and you travel slightly to West, and it's 13 days off because there's different calendar, but it is about days of months, but there were no change of day of week. Day of week was always synchronized. The reform of the calendar did not touch the day of week. And look, Saudi Arabia accepted that Western Gregorian calendar only in 2016, just 5 years ago. And their days of week were the same how days of week were in Europe or in America. And look, Iran or Ethiopia are among those countries which still didn't accept Gregorian calendar. They have their own calendar. Actually, Iran has their own calendar, which is not even the same as in Saudi Arabia. They use a calendar from ancient time, ancient Persian calendar, and they just calculate from the Hijra year, but the year is solar year, not lunar year. So they have completely different months and days. The calendar is different, but the weeks are synchronized. And that's why whenever you will go, if you know that today is Tuesday, you now go to Iran, it will be Tuesday. You go to Ethiopia, it will be Tuesday. But everywhere it will be Tuesday. That's how it always was. Jewish communities in Middle Ages existed from Portugal to India. To some extent, even there were some Jews even in China, not much, but in India there were some Jewish communities. So in all Central Asia, Middle East, Northern Africa, even some European countries, though they didn't like Jews in Europe, but there were Jewish communities and they were all trading with each other, and there were never desynchronization about Shabbat. They were celebrating Shabbat on the same day. So week was never interrupted. So whoever tells you about Gregorian reform affecting week, no, it did not. I mean, historical facts, even today, you can check it. And not all people use Gregorian calendar nowadays. Substitution of feasts starts in very ancient time, and you can see it in look, let us first check about New Year, right? We talked about Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah literally means head of year. Rosh means head, and it corresponds to the Feast of Trumpet, Feast of Blowing of Trumpets, Yom Teruah. But the symbolic is slightly different, as you see. The way of celebration is slightly different nowadays. And what is important also, they somehow, you see, the name is different because they count it now as a new year. But we studied that new year according to Exodus chapter 12. What was taught in Exodus 12? That the month of Pesach is the first month of the year. So the new year is somewhere in March. New year is 2 weeks before the Passover in March. So how on earth it happened? Then Jews started to celebrate their new year in the fall, in September, October. How could it happen? It happened because of influence of Babylon during Babylonian captivity. Look, even the very 7th month of the calendar, in Hebrew, it is named Etanim. You can read it in 1 King 8:2 when it's written, and all the men of Israel assembled themselves unto King Solomon at the feast in the month Etanim, which is the 7th month. Yeah, and we told that Etanim is from flowing, that's because of rain, that's because of later rain, and that is exactly the months where the 3 big feasts are happening. Yom Teruah, blowing trumpets, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, Sukkot, Day of Tabernacles. Well, but in other books of Bible, which were written much later, which were written after Babylonian captivity, the 7th month is named Tishrei. And what does mean Tishrei? Tishrei is actually not Hebrew word, it is Akkadian word. Akkadian is a nation which lived in north of Mesopotamia. It's to north from Babylon. So Babylon is actually under heavy Akkadian influence. And the word Tishritu in Akkadian means beginning, from word shru, to begin. Tishrei is named so because it's beginning of the year of Mesopotamians, of Babylonians, of Akkadians. So in the beginning of October or in September, I'm not sure, they were using lunar calendar, so it could slightly deviate. It was a new year in Babylon, traditional new year. Actually, Babylonians also had 2 new years. They had another one in spring, but the most old one, the religious one, was in the beginning of fall. And that's what Jews accepted somehow during Babylonian captivity, and they started to celebrate it. That is the way how God's nation, always living with Gentiles, start. There happens a diffusion, cultural diffusion, and it is very bad that that diffusion happens from Gentiles into the church. The diffusion should go the other way. The diffusion should go from church to the world, not from world to the church. We should influence Gentiles, not the other way. Before Babylonian captivity, there were also many religious practices related to feasts which were coming to Israel. We can read a couple of places and we'll see, because they are related to something which happens later to the church. In Jeremiah 7:18 is mentioned one of such holidays. The children gather wood, and the fathers kindle the fire, and the women knead their dough to make cakes to the Queen of Heaven, and to pour out drink offerings unto other gods, that they may provoke me to anger. God tells about very specific celebration. What we know what is that? Queen of Heaven, it was a female deity of Asia Minor, which was named Kibele there. It was passed in ancient time to Mesopotamia, and in Mesopotamia they also had that Queen of Heaven, Inanna, Ishtar, Semiramis, and in Syria and near to Israel, it was Astarte. There were several different names, but there was symbolics. The ideas of the cult were the same, the Queen of Heaven, and interestingly, the very title of Queen of Heaven and lots of symbolics in a later time passed, guess to whom? The poor girl would not even think that it would happen to her. Miriam, the mother of Jesus, the person who never in her life celebrated any pagan feast, who never would think that titles and symbolics of pagan holidays will be attributed to her. And the title of Queen of Heaven, she would not pretend to do that. She was good Israeli girl, and it wasn't part of her culture. But these Gentile practices, they are very contagious, and they impregnated church, unfortunately. So over here also, we see that symbolics of some special kind of bakery. It's told that women are kneading dough, making cakes, and certain kind of bakeries, very special bakery, were made in Middle East in and praising that Queen of Heaven. Interesting, I did not know, but I discovered that in Catholic world, there's also certain kind of bakery made on Easter, and it is it is that influence of that Middle Eastern practice. It is influence of that practice which is mentioned in Prophet Isaiah. In France, for example, there is even a special kind of pie made, which is named a log, or like a log of wood, and it's also attributed to Mary, to the Queen of Heaven. So that practices of special bakery, they became very seminal. They influenced many nations, many cultures. In other, oh, by the way, over here, when God tells about it, and God tells that they provoke me to anger, he mentioned all three categories of people. He tells about children, fathers, and mothers. So this responsibility for the sin comes to everybody who somehow participate in Gentile festivities, even to small extent, like gathering wood, what children are doing. You will not think that it is something occult, yes, gathering firewood. But God tells that if you are doing it for this celebration, Gentile celebration, that is sin, that is provoking me to anger. In Ezekiel 8:14, we see another symbolic of religious holidays. Ezekiel 8:14, God tells to prophet Ezekiel about some women. Look, then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was towards the north. And behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. So it is near to Lord's house. They are church members, yes. So they are believers, and at least formally. Why they are weeping for Tammuz? Tammuz is pagan deity, and why they are weeping? Because he dies, but later he resurrects. Actually, Tammuz is imposter of Jesus. In ancient Mesopotamia, they had a cult of Nimrod and Tammuz. Those things were very connected to each other. One was father, another was son. Tammuz was son. And Nimrod dies, then Tammuz is born, and then Tammuz dies and resurrects. There's a whole story. And Tammuz is it's a false messiah, you can tell, because he also dies and resurrects. And women were weeping. That was part of a celebration. They were, I will not go too much into pagan religious practices. Probably it should not be done in sermon. You can read more about it if you want. But those ideas entered into church, into some celebrations in the church. And we will see it now because the cult of Nimrod and Tammuz are seen in celebration of Christmas and in celebration of Easter. Those two biggest holidays are related to cult of Tammuz. I believe we reached the our time milestone of 1 hour. So I think we should stop here and by God's grace to continue next time. Right?